So if you can please find your seats, we're gonna get started. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and really welcome to Brookings. We're so pleased you could join us despite the rain. And to those of you online as well, please welcome. My name is Brahima Coulibaly. I'm the Vice President of the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings. And it's my pleasure really to open today's event and launch of the 4th annual Brookings USMCA Flagship Report. These annual reports, as you know, distill important body of work based on rigorous analysis of the evolving dynamics of trade and economic integration across North America. The importance of the USMCA for the region's vitality cannot be overstated. It represents really a cornerstone of economic cooperation, shaping industries, supply chains, labor markets, technological innovations across the region. As we move forward toward the review of the agreement, this report provides timely insights into the successes, challenges, and opportunities to maximize the potential of the USMCA. The reports highlight several critical themes that my colleague Josh Messler, who is the lead researcher on the USMCA initiative, will cover shortly. Now, since its implementation, we've tracked the USMCA, and it has played a crucial role in strengthening regional trade ties, ensuring fair labor practices, and fostering innovation in key industries such as the automotive, manufacturing, energy transition minerals, and semiconductor supply chains, among others. As the global economic conditions change, it is imperative to reassess how the agreement can be optimized to further enhance competitiveness and resilience within North America. The USMCA has proven to be a resilient and adaptable framework, and we continue to refine, and strengthen it to meet the challenges of an evolving global and regional landscape. The latest challenge, of course, are the unilateral tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on Canada and Mexico, which are inconsistent with the agreement and do not bode very well for regional cooperation. Based on some simulation analysis we've done here at Brookings, this tariff will severely impact the three economies and push up the cost of living of households across the region. So the impact gets even worse if Mexico and Canada choose to retaliate. I am, however, optimistic and hopeful that this is a temporary setback and that we will get back on track sooner rather than later. As we discuss the findings and recommendations, I encourage all of us to think about the future of and the vision for North American economic integration. And to conclude, I would like to express on behalf of the Brookings Institution my gratitude to the co-chairs of the USMCA initiative for their support and leadership, trustee and co-chair of Brookings IAC, Victor Dodig, who you're going to hear from shortly, trustee Paul Desmarais, who couldn't be here today, and IAC member Pablo Gonzalez. I'd like to also use this opportunity to pay tribute to Pat Ottenmeyer, who was one of the co-chairs, but who unfortunately passed away last fall. And our gratitude, of course, and appreciation extends to the authors of the report, the scholars and experts who have contributed their knowledge, and to all of you for your engagement in this vital discussion at this crucial time. And I look forward to an enlightening conversation ahead. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's Victor Dodig. He is the president and CEO of the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. And as I mentioned earlier, he's also Brookings trustee and co-chair of the Brookings IAC and co-chair of the USMCA initiative. So he's a busy man, but he's with us nonetheless. And by way of disclosure, in addition to Victor, we have two other speakers you'll hear from later today. Leila from Toyota and John Stackhouse from the Royal Bank of Canada, whose institutions provide general support to Brookings, which helps make the work we do possible. So I'd like to reiterate then Brookings' commitment to independence and underscore that the views expressed are solely those of the speakers. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Victor. Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank Thank you. Thank you very much. He's much more modern than I am, reading off his iPad rather than the paper notes that I have. I want to tell you what a pleasure it is to be here today. Just to give you full disclosure, I'm married to an American. I have 4 kids who are dual citizens, all of which currently reside in the United States. One's at Dartmouth, 4 are the graduates of the University of Notre Dame. And I've lived the past 30 years of my life with Maureen in a very North American mindset. We cross the border regularly. We have relatives and friends on both sides of the border. And the agreement and the trade relationship we have goes well beyond the numbers. It goes into the relationships as well. The timing for today's report couldn't be more timely. We are in the depths of renegotiations, retaliatory tariffs, new tariffs, even though we have a trade agreement that was signed years back. These actions will no doubt create volatility. It'll create uncertainty. It'll create anxiety. And we're already seeing that in our clients that we serve. We've served clients on both sides of the border. We have American clients, we have Canadian clients, and clients around the world. And everybody is more tentative with the uncertainty that's taken hold. In terms of the overall relationship, and I'll speak between the Canada-U.S. relationship more specifically, 75% of Canada's exports go to the United States. So this matters to Canada as a nation. At the same time, over 2/3 of the states count Canada as their largest destination for exports of all nations that they serve. So we're inextricably linked. It's often claimed that the deficit with Canada is $100 billion, maybe $200 billion. These are the facts. The facts are that there is a trade deficit with Canada, largely because of energy, an energy that the United States needs and in fact uses to make goods that are stamped made in the USA. If you strip out energy, Canada is the only large trading nation with which the United States has a trade surplus, a manufacturing trade surplus in the order of $30 billion. 70% of which Canada exports to the United States is usually used in the manufacture of U.S. goods, as I just mentioned. At the same time, the discussions don't touch on services. There's a trade surplus that the United States has with Canada, nor the investment flows that work between our two countries. This trading relationship that we have, and I'm sure you're going to hear throughout the day, is the strongest, most vital trading relationship in the world today, and is something that we need to build on. Build on because of the long relationship that we had, the integrated nature of our respected economies, and I said at the outset, because of the important human connectivity that exists between Canada and the United States. 800,000 Canadians live in the United States. 1 million Americans live in Canada, almost half of them in Toronto, and they call both places home. 15 million Americans visit Canada every year, and 20 million Canadians visit the United States every year. That just gives you a sense for the size and breadth and depth of the relationship. So within USMCA, the agreement is large. It's $1.8 trillion in goods that are traded annually between 3 nations. It really does link up to 17 million jobs. And it was an agreement that was modernized by President Trump in his first term. Modernized for good reasons. Agreements that are signed in 1987 and 1993 and 1993 need to be modernized to reflect the reality of today. And perhaps that's what we're trying to tackle again today, is another accelerated modernization for a variety of reasons. So my hope is that we can quickly get over the problems in the very short term of applying tariffs and retaliatory tariffs. The 25% tariff that was placed on Canada and Mexico was placed primarily using certain economic powers that relate to national security and primarily tied to fentanyl and illegal migration. Fentanyl is a problem that we all have In fact, in some months, Canada's fentanyl deaths per capita are higher than they are in the United States. So tackling fentanyl, tackling illegal migration, tackling handguns and arms that go between borders and create crime, that needs to be tackled together. And I can tell you as a Canadian, the Canadian government's absolutely committed to it. I know that oftentimes we'll say that less than 1% of the fentanyl that comes from Canada, it comes from Canada or through Canada. 1% is too much. We need to aim for zero. And I agree with the current administration on that one. We absolutely need to crush the scourge of crime, crush the scourge of drugs, and crush illegal migration and put order back into our system. What is the best way to achieve that? I think the best way to achieve that is through dialogue. And ideally, in rooms where people that have all the knowledge can work through the problems together. The other issue that's been highlighted is unfair competition from China. We see that in electric vehicles, we see that in aluminum and steel, and that's something that Canada needs to, and Mexico needs to, work aggressively on to make sure that this North American economic zone is producing its own aluminum and steel for its own uses and for the rest of the world. So the agreement was set to be renegotiated in 2026. I think we'll all see a rapidly renegotiated agreement. I'm hopeful that the key players on all three sides can get to some reasonable approach so that we don't do any unjust harm to our respective economies, because it's so clear in my mind that in the short term, if we go down this path, there will be harm. Even though there are long-term goals, there will be severe short and medium-term disruptions that are absolutely unnecessary. We're hearing a lot about that today and what it might mean for the auto sector specifically, but I'm hoping that it's a broader approach to put down the arms of tariffs and to work together to create a USMCA 2.0 that'll work for everyone and will raise the standard of living for Americans, for Canadians, and for Mexicans. So with that, thank you for having me here today. Thank you, Cool and Josh, for all the great work that the Brookings team does. Independent, fact-based analysis with the goal of creating a more vibrant, a stronger, and a more integrated economy for this trading zone. And this discussion today, I think, will bring out that in spades. Thank you very much.
So, Victor, Cool, thank you very much for those opening remarks. Thank you to everyone for making and braving the wet weather today. It's great to see a full house. Certainly interesting times, and this conversation we're going to have this afternoon couldn't be too timely. So I lead the USMCA initiative here at Brookings, and to state the obvious, this event comes at a time when I think economic and trade and diplomatic relations between the United States, Canada and Mexico are particularly fraught. We all know that yesterday President Trump placed a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico, additional 10% tariff on imports from China as well. And it's worth just stating that the scope and size of these tariffs is unprecedented. It certainly far outweighs any of the tariffs that Trump put on China and elsewhere during his first term in office. And he's also said that should Canada and Mexico retaliate, which seems to be on the cards, he will essentially escalate. So we could very quickly be in the middle of a very significant trade war between the United States and its two most important trading partners, Canada and Mexico. Now, President Trump has claimed that these tariffs are needed to address flows of fentanyl and illegal immigration. What certainly is clear is that a 25% tariff is going to reduce economic growth, it's going to raise prices, it's going to diminish jobs and wages as well. We've heard today a little bit about how so much of the trade that happens, say, between the United States and Canada is essentially intermediate products. So 2/3, 70% of products essentially that come from Canada are being used to manufacture and develop other products. So it's just clear that when you think about the structure of the economic relationship, the role that supply chains play, that 25% tariffs on goods moving across borders multiple times to produce autos, electronic products and other goods adds up very quickly and makes entire industries uneconomical. And the tariffs are not going to hit industrial sectors in similar way. We've done a bit of analysis here at Brookings modelling the impact of tariffs and retaliation, and we find that over the medium term you're going to see in sectors such as auto, manufactured products, US exports to Canada could contract by as much as 60%. In areas of lumber, metals and computer and electronic equipment, 70 to 80% contractions in US exports to Mexico. The one country, though, that will be a winner from a trade war between the United States, Canada and Mexico will be China. These tariffs will undercut efforts to reshore supply chains away from China into North America. And the willingness of the United States to impose tariffs on its largest trading partners is sending a signal globally to allies and friends alike that they need to reduce their trade exposure to the United States, including being more open to expanding trade and investment relations with other countries as well as China. Now, these tariffs may be a negotiating tactic. We've heard that the USMCA is up for review. This must be done by the middle of next year. So under the agreement, all the parties have essentially agreed that they have to do this review. All the parties need to agree to extend the term of the USMCA for another 16 years. If that doesn't happen next year, there's essentially a 10-year runway. If we do not get an agreement in that 10 years, the agreement does expire in 2036. Now, today we're launching the USMCA Initiative's flagship report, the USMCA Forward. There's, I think, a QR code, a flyer with a QR code on all the seats here, so you can access that online, and we're going to have paper copies available as well if you so wish. And this report focuses on the key areas where updating USMCA can deepen cooperation between the United States, Mexico and Canada in ways that is needed to strengthen manufacturing and to compete with China. This report includes chapters written by experts from think tanks, from academia, as well as shorter viewpoints, high-level policy statements from leaders across government, industry and civil society. And together the report really provides a comprehensive assessment of the opportunities we have here to build a more fairer and competitive North American trade and investment partnership. So we have contributions from Mexico's Secretary of the Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, former Deputy USTR, CJ Mahoney, AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler, and leaders across business and industry from the three economies as well. But before I get into how we can improve USMCA, and we're going to talk about this in more detail on the panels as well, it's worth just taking stock of where we are today. As you know, this agreement was negotiated and signed by President Trump, came into effect in 2020. And the fact is that it has only been operational for a short period of time, 4 odd years, and the existence of various phase-in commitments in the agreement for automobiles in particular means that it is honestly too early to draw any strong conclusions about the success or otherwise of the agreement so far. But that said, looking at the evidence, what is clear is that the agreement has been a success, if a qualified one, certainly with room for improvement. Since USMCA has come into effect, US exports to Canada and Mexico have increased by around 45%. Exports from across the three countries support around 17 million jobs. And a report last year by the International Trade Commission looking specifically at the impact of the auto chapter and the tightened rules of origin concluded that the agreement has, quote, increased employment, production, revenue, capital expenditure and profits. The USMCA also included a binding commitments on environment and labour and a rapid response mechanism which allows for the United States to address complaints about labour violations at facilities in Mexico. We've seen the US has brought around 32 complaints using this mechanism, and most have been resolved to the United States' satisfaction. However, it is also the case that since USMCA was negotiated, some major events have happened. We've had certainly the more intensifying of geopolitical competition between the United States and China. We had COVID, we had Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and all of this sought to reveal the fragility of global supply chains. It really underscored some of the economic and national security challenges of relying on China for inputs of critical products as well. And so we've seen a whole-of-government effort over the last 4 years to try to reduce dependencies on China in areas such as critical minerals, but also to innovate and to run faster and to stay ahead in key technologies such as artificial intelligence, and to catch up in some of the key industries of the future, such as in batteries and EVs. This report addresses squarely where deeper cooperation between the three economies is needed to address these challenges, and provides a very comprehensive set of policy recommendations of what more we can do with USMCA to achieve that. So let me run through this briefly. If you start with critical minerals, what is very clear is that if you want to reduce US dependency on critical minerals and rare earths and develop a more North American-centred source of supply, then it's a complex challenge, but working collaboratively with Mexico, and in particular Canada, is absolutely essential. So we have authors such as Bentley Allen from Johns Hopkins, Tom Morenhout from Columbia University, and Melissa Barbanel from WRI, who have all contributed to the report, who all essentially make this point. And this is just due to the fact that there is where the actual sort of minerals are deposited and where they exist is geologically dispersed, requiring this level of cooperation. Now, various USMCA updates that could spur investment and mining into refining capacity could include tariffs on imports of critical minerals, agreeing a list of critical minerals that would count in calculating regional content values, and more alignment on anti-dumping and countervailing duties and investment screening when it comes to critical minerals. When you take the transition to EVs, China is now the world's largest producer and exporter. And again, this presents an economic and security challenge for the United States. Batteries is the key technological innovation in EVs, and batteries require access to critical minerals. The Inflation Reduction Act, with its consumer tax credit tied to local content criteria for critical minerals and battery components, has supported development already of a more integrated North America battery and EV supply chain. Diana Paez from the University of Michigan, who is also an author to the report, has really underscored that it's still going to take a number of years for these investments stimulated by the IRA to come online, and with the problem of reliance on China for critical minerals and battery production remains to be resolved. Various ways in the report, again, that we can try to get at these issues and where USMCA can help would be, for instance, harmonising tariffs on imports of EVs from China, developing common EV standards across North America, and developing a more focused North American auto dialogue. Turning to semiconductors and artificial intelligence, another focus of this report. Paul Triolo is here today, who contributed that chapter. Now, President Trump has said already that the goal for the United States with respect to AI is to sustain and enhance America's dominance, promote human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security. Now, the Chips and Sciences Act has certainly kick-started efforts to rebuild semiconductor manufacturing capability in the United States, and there's a lot that Canada and Mexico and the United States can do together to support this goal, whether it's on talent, building an AI workforce, investment in AI technologies, and aligning on AI regulation. And the USMCA, with its very robust digital trade chapter, is the obvious place to start there. Let me make two final points here. Building more secure and resilient supply chains is just going to require more trade and investment across North America. But for this to happen, we also need to get serious about two additional issues. One is the ongoing concerns about labour and environmental standards in Mexico in particular, and the other is concerns about Chinese products transshipping through Canada and Mexico into the United States. Now, we know that the USMCA already has the rapid response mechanism, and in a chapter actually last year in the report by Kathleen Clausen from Georgetown Law School, she went through the learning that we have gotten from the rapid response mechanism and ways that we can strengthen and improve it. Chinese circumvention is a relatively new issue. It's a response to US tariffs on China, and we have seen important progress in Canada in particular, and Mexico may be moving in that direction as well. But the bottom line is that we need much greater alignment on tariffs and investment screening across North America to address this issue. If you want to learn more about the work we're doing, please go to the website, you go to the report here. I also just want to make a quick plug for our USMCA tracker, which is really a go-to source of data on trade, investment and jobs across North America. We have released today essentially one-pages for every state, province and territory across North America, where you can get quick information on top exports, top jobs and that are generated by these exports into which provinces and countries. So you have in front of you just the facts about how economically important this agreement is for the three countries. Let me now turn to how we're going to run the rest of the afternoon. We've got two panels. On the first panel, we're going to have a lot of the authors of the report, where we're going to get into a lot more detail on topics of critical minerals and EVs and batteries and AI. We will then have a very short 5-minute coffee break. We will then transition to a second panel where we're going to zoom out a little from the particulars, and we're going to look more broadly at developments in North America and the future of USMCA. We're going to wrap at around 4 o'clock. We're going to provide time for audience Q&A, so please stick around. And let me now call upon the first panel to come up on stage, please. So the breaking news apparently is that tariffs on autos have been paused. So we're in a very fluid situation, just as a heads up for the panel, which is, yeah. So look, I want to firstly thank the panel for being here and for your contributions to the report. And we're going to cover a range of topics this afternoon. I actually want to start maybe down this end of the panel with semiconductors and artificial intelligence. And maybe I'll start with you, Paul, to ask you, where are we at? We had the Chips and Sciences Act, which has been critical in stimulating production of semiconductors in the United States. Where are we at? And, feel free to elaborate on what do you see coming down the pipeline, and we'll get into the cooperation piece shortly.
Yeah, and of course you picked a great time to ask that question, just hours after I was up late last night watching the current president basically call for killing the Chips and Science Act. So I think it's a really complicated issue right now. I think I spent the whole morning answering reporters' questions on this issue about whether the Chips Act. I think by any measure, the Chips Act has been successful in sort of driving home the idea that North America, and of course the U.S. in particular, should be doing more to onshore some level of semiconductor industry production. So I think in that sense, the CHIPS Act has been pretty successful. I mean, all the commitments we've seen over the last 2 years, for example, from TSMC and Intel and Samsung and Micron, we help many companies with their CHIPS Act applications, and part of that's really important, it gets to some of the collaborative issues here in North America, is workforce development. And so that's been a really tricky thing, right? If you're going to onshore all this advanced manufacturing, you need a workforce that's geared to do this. And of course, we've seen the challenges that companies like TSMC have had in Arizona in particular, and Arizona is really important. in this, and ASU is important in the broader sense of collaboration in North America. But Arizona, really tricky thing, finding companies, pipe fitters that can install equipment and build clean rooms, et cetera, et cetera. So part of the goal of the whole CHIPS Act is to sort of improve the whole ecosystem around advanced semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S. But it's complicated, right? For example, we've also had in the last week, in addition to President Trump last night basically calling for some revision of the CHIPS Act, we've had President Trump host a TSMC senior official pledge another $100 billion in investment in North America, in this case in Arizona. So those two things may seem incompatible, but clearly that demonstrates that the CHIPS Act has been successful in that sense in attracting companies to site facilities in the U.S. and bring along with them supply chains. Interestingly, that particular agreement that appears to include R&D and packaging, which is a huge thing in terms of onshoring supply chains. The goal, keep in mind of this, that former Secretary Raimondo articulated last year, was by 2030 to onshore 20% of global capacity in advanced node semiconductor manufacturing end to end. Okay, so that means everything from wafer production, front-end manufacturing, to packaging. And that's a tall order, right? And then we've had recently, of course, companies like Intel and Samsung are having a lot of difficulties in their business models, which have called into question some of these goals. Intel, for example, is not going to complete facilities in Ohio until 2030, and so that's a long time. So it looks like we're going to have a really nice cluster in Arizona. And one of my contentions has long been probably the U.S. can only support one such cluster, one or maybe two, but maybe two smaller ones. So Arizona is looking more and more like it's going to be an important cluster, and that's important also because ASU is so important to that workforce development piece, and they're a part of the broader International Technology and Security Initiative, which is part of CHIPS, which is $100 million a year for 5 years to support developing resilient supply chains in North America, not just in North America, but in Asia also. And ASU is very much at the center of that, and as I go into it in my paper, and even some new developments since the paper went to press. So Arizona is going to be a really important piece of the sort of North America supply chain and development of workforce, and also of some elements of packaging and advanced testing and packaging. But with the new situation in Washington, the future of the CHIPS Act in general, and then of some of the specific funding initiatives like ITSE are certainly in question. Although, again, if you look across the amount of money involved here, arguably some of the collaborative efforts and the workforce development efforts really are so critical that hopefully they will get a hard look and be viewed as positive. But I think in general, there's a lot of question marks around where we're going on this. And finally, I'll just say, I was asked this morning, can the president kill the CHIPS Act? I think it's really complicated. It's legislation that was very bipartisan, lots of support. Everybody seems to support increasing U.S. advanced manufacturing capability. It's a national security issue. There's a China angle to this, of course, China-Taiwan angle. That's very, very important. And then these agreements that have been signed between companies like Micron and Intel and TSMC and Samsung, these are considered binding agreements, right? So I think it'd be very difficult and messy and litigious potentially to roll those agreements back. So I think that some chunk of the CHIPS Act funding is going to survive. There are a few items that can be rolled back and can sort of be clawed back. But this is a complicated agreement. Those agreements took 2 years to develop with companies. Not a pretty, the sausage making was very complicated and ugly. But we've gotten to this point, so I would have a hard time thinking that the whole thing is going to be rolled back. But we don't really know. The uncertainty introduced just by this comment last night is certainly something that we will be watching and others will be watching, and hopefully it will not impact the collaborative piece of this for North America and Asia that's so critical, because no country can onshore the whole supply chain for just advanced semiconductors, and the friend-shoring piece of that is really important, and hopefully that will survive.
Thanks, Paul. And I should say, Paul is a, for those who don't know you, a partner and global technology lead at DG Albright Stonebridge, and I think you're also visiting senior fellow at Asia Policy Society, right? Asia Society Policy, yep. And I do want to recognise Melissa, who's joined us online, who also contributed a chapter, Melissa Barbanel, who has been, until recently, Director of US International Engagement at WRI, World Resources Institute, and to my right here, we have Daniela Rojas, who is at the EON Institute in Mexico, working on artificial intelligence issues. I'm going to turn to you shortly. Diana Paez from the William Davidson Institute at University of Michigan, and Bentley Allen at Johns Hopkins University. So, Diana, let me pick up on what sort of Paul was saying on the semiconductor piece. If we think about the stack of technology needed to build AI, we've got that as a critical component that's been developed in North America. How is Mexico thinking about its role, its space when it comes to AI, and how it links in with what's happening in the United States?
Hi, everybody. My name is Daniela Rojas. First of all, I'm so glad to be here. I'm honored to be here. I'm the Senior Program Officer of EON Institute, that is a Mexican think tank, that we try to develop a future-proof society, which technology can serve as a driving force to inclusive growing and also competitiveness. So saying that USMCA is such a hot topic, like this past few hours, not just days, like few hours, has been really crazy. And that's the first thing that we need to acknowledge. Like, we are living, we are facing a critical moment. Yeah? We already mentioned that. And we need to reflect on this critical moment. Yeah. And also, we can talk about tariffs, but I'm going to focus on AI. Why? Because AI could also serve as a key element in the future negotiations around USMCA. Why? Because we are facing this AI race while the US is currently leading the AI development. Also, China has improved a lot of advancements around AI, such as patents, or AI models such as DeepSeek, or chips optimizations. So now, this context has put into perspective that maybe, a solution could be to coordinate a response for all North America to help to confront this force. So the USMCA have already laid the groundwork for that. For example, in digital trade, also by reducing barriers on cross-border data, and also by fostering innovation-friendly policies. And also we need to take into consideration that the US has been really clear about the fact that AI is not just about innovation, it's also a national security priority. And both Canada and Mexico could be the best allies to safeguard these objectives. But we are seeing these policies around tariffs, but also in other technological and restrictive technological policies, for example, with the AI diffusion rule, that maybe the United States is not seeing us as an allies. And yeah, that's the problem, the main problem here. And this is a missed opportunity for the USMCA to have a stronger framework around these technologies could serve, for example, or could enable Mexico to be a more active element, for example, in the AI supply chain. And with this element, for example, Mexico is already moving towards this direction. Sheinbaum has already made a priority innovation hubs and also semiconductor manufacturing. So this framework could serve to Mexico to be more important actor into these discussions. And for that, we need to think about like a tripartite collaboration and 4 key elements. The first one, the strategic investments around frontier technologies. The second, aligning industrial policy to strengthen nearshoring policies. The third one, developing an unified regional strategy around frontier technologies such as AI. And the fourth one is to promote specialized training programs. So in this future negotiation, the 3 countries must put the cards on the table and must be really clear about the priorities of each country. And in the Mexican perspective, we have been part of this conversation since 2018. Actually, we were one of the first countries to have the basis of a national AI agenda, but we have this change in administration, and AI was no longer a priority, but now it is. And we want to add value to this phenomenon and this development. And we're seeing, for example, these innovation hubs. We want to be part of the semiconductor manufacturing in the Senate and also in the deputy chambers. We are seeing the construction of committees focus on AR or in semiconductors. So we want to be part of the conversation. And also, we have the workforce. We have AI trained workforce. So we need to integrate that in that discussion for the future USMCA negotiations.
Great, thanks. I'm going to come back to AI and semiconductors, but I want to bring now Bentley and Melissa into the conversation. Let me start with you, Bentley. Talk to us about critical minerals, and particularly what we need to see between, I think, the United States and Canada in particular, if we're going to get serious about reducing dependencies in China and scaling up investment and refining capacity.
Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you for having me here. I'm also have a North American family. I'm a Canadian. I've lived here for way too long. And I only have 3 kids. 4 seems a little ambitious. But yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. One story that I wanted to start with is you've probably all now seen the story of the auto part that crosses the border multiple times, maybe crosses both borders before it ends up in a vehicle. But we also have the same situation in critical minerals, which makes the tariffs on Canada and Mexico particularly confusing for a government that states that it would like to achieve independence from Chinese critical mineral dominance and to achieve energy dominance more broadly. So take, for example, there's a zinc mine up in Alaska, and they fly that zinc out of that zinc mine, and they fly it to Trail, British Columbia, where it is refined in a smelter. One of the byproducts of that smelting process is germanium, which is used in the AI, which is used in the semiconductor industry here in the United States. And so it's this really weird situation where you're putting tariffs on kind of like American germanium that just happened to pass through a refining step in Canada. And then that semiconductor is very likely going to be shipped back to Canada as an exported integrated circuit, whether it's in another electronic product or whether it's just as a regular chip crossing the border. So critical minerals into the electronics pathway is another way in which we have products crossing the borders multiple times before they finally hit consumers. And it really, lays on the point that you mentioned, Josh, which is that China has put germanium on the export control list, on the export ban list for the United States. So at the exact moment in which the Biden administration had to spend a lot of time to try to create alternative sources of gallium and germanium, we're going to make that gallium and germanium from a friendly partner now more expensive here in the United States. It's very, very confusing. If we really wanted to get serious about China, we need to understand the market power that China has. China has concentrated control of a number of these minerals, which means it can effectively set prices in the global market. You look at what's happening with nickel investment. It's been very cool for the last couple of years, in part because Chinese investment into Indonesian supply has created a surplus of nickel in the global market, depressing prices from places like Canada and Russia and other classical producers of nickel. You've got the same situation or similar situations in copper, rare earths, graphite, et cetera. Again, so these are areas where there's a real opportunity for North American countries to cooperate and build up the supplies, but you have high price uncertainty because other market players basically are have controlling price power in the market. So you need to provide price certainty if you're going to unlock investment into those sectors, but it's difficult to achieve that with the historic tools of industrial policy or lack thereof in North America. So what we need is a more robust cooperative framework between the three countries that enables them to align and coordinate their industrial policies around critical minerals. I outline 5 specific elements of that in the report. The first is harmonizing their tariffs. So we've seen a little bit of this with Becent on Sunday. One of the many dangles of maybe we're going to release the tariffs in exchange for Fortress North America. We'll all do collaborative tariffs on China in exchange for releasing some parts of the tariffs. That is now Wednesday, and it's a completely different set of stories, but we'll just bypass that for a moment. That could be that's one tool in the toolbox. Tariffs are going to be a tool in the toolbox of securing critical minerals markets, but they alone are not sufficient, and certainly not Chinese tariffs, because we only really get graphite and fluorospar in any significant amounts here in the United States from China. So there are other tools that would need to be part of the toolbox, like aligning subsidies, but also coming up with a co-investment framework, which is to say a way for the US and Mexico and Canada to invest alongside one another in critical minerals. It was really difficult to watch during the Biden administration them understand this problem, but then have no callable capital to draw on globally in order to invest in mines. The Biden administration understood that you needed to invest globally, but had no capital to do so. The best it could do was ask the Saudis and the other Gulf states if they could please invest in a mine, point to a map, point to a business case for other folks with capital on hand. We need to fix that problem. We need to create financial authorities in North America that can invest in North American metals. There's a little bit of that happening through the Defense Production Act. The U.S. has invested in 6 Canadian mining projects, including a tungsten mine up in Yukon, which China also put on the export control list earlier this month. So China is basically ringing the bell and saying, you know, we would like to continue to exercise geopolitical leverage using our critical mineral supply chains, but we have to get really focused in terms of the collaborative policy approach that would be necessary in order to truly create a North American mining boom that would help reduce that leverage. But the assets and the resources are there. We just need to figure out the policy situation.
Great, that's super helpful. Melissa, in your chapter, you also touched on, I think, some of the environmental and social impacts of mining and the ways that North America, through standards and other mechanisms, can kind of strengthen what we do here, both in a sense, it's an energy efficiency competitiveness argument. There's a China argument, which is that these mines are not being produced. The mining that's happening in China and other countries is, you know, using low labour standards, very poor environmental practices. So it's another way of kind of distinguishing what happens in North America from the rest of the world. Can you talk more to that, about that opportunity there?
Yes, thank you. I think that there are a lot of opportunities. The U.S. and Canada and Mexico do have strong environmental and social standards and labor standards in place, which we don't see coming from other countries, particularly China. We know that some of it is in the law in the United States and Canada particularly, but also in Mexico. And in what we see also, though, is that there's efforts to use voluntary approaches. The Mineral Security Partnership, which the U.S. and Canada have been members of, and Mexico recently joined the forum is trying to set its own set of standards around this. And this would be an opportunity if we set tariffs or set up standards to really get preference for minerals that are produced responsibly. That would be one tool that the countries could use to ensure that we are preferring minerals produced responsibly, and that would mean minerals produced in North America. We do know that there's really a range of problems, and a lot of it relates to labor treatment. And what we see with China investing in Indonesia and abroad is that they're starting to work on this, and they're starting to try to do these things, but really they're very, very far behind where we are in North America. So there's an opportunity by focusing on responsible mining, to do it through either government procurement, through things like we see in the IRA with foreign entities of concern. There's that kind of a model as well, which would really, and the IRA is also a place where we've seen the model of really having a preference for, in the auto sector, minerals coming from North America, be that refining or mining itself. So there's really a lot of opportunity in this space with that lens to drive improved performance. And also another opportunity is around recycling. And I do think that we're seeing a burgeoning recycling effort happening in North America. And so that's a real place where there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity for innovation around remining of tailings. And so there's really, in the recycling world and in the remining world, there's an opportunity there as well for us to really work together with our neighbors to make sure that we are driving best performance and really the lowest impact. We know that end-of-life copper, North America accounts for 11% of the market of end-of-life scrap copper recycling. And doing so is an 85% less impact than virgin copper mining. So there's just really a lot of different ways to slice it and wind up with a cleaner supply chain and a North American supply chain.
Paul, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think these are all great comments. I just wanted to add a quick cautionary tale. I mean, and we deal with companies, for example, in the EV battery supply chain, and it's really not just about the mining and even the processing. It's oftentimes about who owns the IP to make the finished product. And so, for example, we worked with a Japanese company that wanted to set up a joint venture in the U.S. With a U.S. partner. The material may have been coming from Mexico and Canada even, but they needed a Chinese partner for the IP to produce the finished product, and that Chinese company had a 10-year lead according to the industry. So I think we need to think a little more, think creatively. In that case, okay, is the inclusion of Chinese IP in a joint venture that was also very environmentally friendly. The Japanese brought a really interesting and new process to producing the graphite. So anyway, I think it's a cautionary tale. I'll just say, focusing on just the mining and the resource, the processing and ultimately producing that end product is really critical to having a full supply chain. And just, Melissa, I'd like you focus on what you call, I think, energy transition materials. We've heard a bit about the uses of critical minerals in batteries and in the kind of AI and chip sector. Can you lay out a little bit for us, just briefly, how we should be thinking about these minerals in the energy transition space, whether it's in batteries or EVs or solar or whatever it may be, just to give a sense of like how widespread and important these critical minerals actually are into the kind of the next generation of industries and innovations that are going to be happening in this country.
Absolutely. One of the most important markets really is the EV battery markets. And there are just certain minerals that are top of mind: lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and these minerals. What we know is that right now we are producing those in very small amounts in North America. There's been a report that came out by Argonne National Lab that said by 2035, the U.S. could be producing 20 to 25% of the world's lithium, and Canada could be producing 10 to 15%. So there's really, some of these minerals are really integral. If we're going to have a transition to an EVs, we're going to need that. Another mineral that's really most important in this space, and it's not been historically on the USGS's critical minerals list in the United States, is copper. And the reason it hasn't been on the list historically is that there's a lot of copper in the ground in the United States. And so copper is needed for transmission, as well as it's used in vehicles, in wind turbines. It's used in every aspect of the clean energy transition. So at WRI, we've been focusing mostly on copper, lithium, and nickel as the main areas that we're focused on, because these are some of the minerals that really are potentially choke points to being able to have a clean energy transition. And these are minerals where they each face very different challenges. So, with lithium, we worry a lot about water consumption, because a lot of it is brine mining. And whereas, for instance, nickel, which is Indonesia, is so far in the lead in terms of nickel production, and the amount of, first there you have Chinese captive coal plants that are really behind the mining and processing of nickel in Indonesia, and also significant potential impacts to water and forests and communities. And so these are some of the minerals that we've been most focused on because they really are the things that absolutely we have to have them if we're going to have a clean energy transition. IEA wrote a report, and there have been several reports. We're talking about lithium potentially 40-fold increase in the amount of it that we need in the next 25 years. So the others are a lesser increase, maybe 4 or 8 times, but lithium is really the standout there.
Can I just jump in on that real quickly? Mexico also has great lithium reserves. That's one of the problems with having big projections of any particular country providing a lot of lithium, because everybody's actually got a lot of lithium. It's quite common. Whether or not countries can do it economically is separate. But I did want to add Mexico there. And the other thing that we need for the energy transition, which Melissa did not mention, is we need a lot of silver. It has these great conductive properties, so we need it in a lot of electronic applications in an electrified future. And Mexico is actually the world's #1 producer of silver. So it's really important to include Mexico in the critical minerals conversation.
Great. Did you want to
also don't forget the rare earths, because to make those batteries efficient, you need the rare earth magnets. And again, China has a fairly nice chokehold over the rare earth industry, and last week published a couple of rules that we're looking at very closely, which would tighten control over production in China and potentially outside of China of rare earth elements that are critical to the magnet and hence to the green transition. So don't forget rare earths.
Yeah. So a lot going on.
One thing.
No,
if I can, just to add, one thing that we do know is that rare earths are co-located with zinc and other deposits and copper deposits. And so it's often, the challenge is really the separation, and they're called rare earths, but they're not rare. They're really common in the Earth's crust. They're just not economic to produce, and they have radionuclides associated with them, which makes them problematic. But one thing that we do know is that, there are, for instance, germanium-rich deposits in tailing sites. So this is one of these areas where remining can be really useful. There's one MSP project, a Mineral Security Partnership project, that's already underway in the Congo, and it's a Belgian company that's doing it. But we're seeing this can be a model where this Belgian company is processing rare earths from the tailings in Congo and then bringing it to market. So we need to think about those models when we think about rare earths too.
Great. There's a lot going on here. Actually, this is a great way of bringing you, Indiana, to talk about EVs. You can talk about critical minerals in EVs if you wish, but maybe just level set for us in terms of where are we with the transition to EVs at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see what you did there, because all of these things come together really into an EV, right? And so it really, it was well planned. And a lot of the themes that you all have talked about are also relevant for EV transition as we think about onshoring supply chains, a lot of those same push, I think, in terms of both for the US and North America. And in my chapter, I delve into trying to understand, first and foremost, the framework of USMCA as it relates to promoting, enabling, or hindering, or there's a spectrum there in terms of this EV transition, and understanding the state of play for each of the countries. And I think for the US specifically, we've seen in the past few years a lot of investment from automakers as well as suppliers all along the supply chain. First, a little bit slowly, then in the past couple of years, especially at a much faster clip, based on, of course, an enabling policy framework, a lot of incentives through the Inflation Reduction Act, and the added framework of USMCA that really encourages and in 2020 included increased regional value content as well. So those components really have pushed for localizing the supply chain, understanding that there was very little capacity for developing these batteries, the materials and the minerals that are needed as well to be able to do that, and onshore production. So in the past few years, between 2020 and late 2024, there's been about $250 billion investment in North America in terms of EV supply chain, electric vehicles and batteries specifically. And really most of that has been in the US, about 80% of that. And a really large part of that is in the battery space. So certainly the call to action is onshore the supply chain for batteries. However, the problem remains that a lot of those materials that are needed for batteries do not, originate in North America. So battery manufacturing capacity in the US has doubled in the past 2 years, since 2022, and there's more than 3x of that manufacturing capacity in the pipeline as well. So back to your point, Josh, there's definitely some more time that needs to elapse for those investments to come online. And the key technology that requires those batteries, of course, it's electric vehicles. So where are we in terms of U.S. auto industry and transitioning to electric vehicles, and also more broadly, North American industry? Because as has been made abundantly clear, the industry is quite integrated across the 3 countries. And so there are these very intricate process of co-production. You mentioned the piston example, which has been, of course, making the rounds, and I think it's a beautiful way to describe this precise process. So what happens when, at the same time that you are increasing this regional value content and also developing different policy tools, right, to enable this transition to electrification? I think it opens up an opportunity to re-examine USMCA and understand where are we now in terms of progress made in developing that supply chain, and also what needs to happen still to be able to compete globally. There's also a lot of work to do, I think, in terms of market uptake, both in the US and in Mexico and Canada as well. And there are a lot of policy tools from different, supply as well as demand to be able to bolster the domestic market as well. Because we can produce a lot of EVs, but if we don't have a strong market and uptake and the right type of product, affordable, if there isn't charging infrastructure, if there's really not addressing a lot of those consumer pain points, then the transition will simply not be successful. And I think I'll add to that the China piece, and of course it's been discussed, but just to make a little bit of a finer point in terms of China and electric vehicles. They started, of course, identifying this electric vehicle technology as a crucial one more than 10 years ago as part of Made in China 2025 plans and many other policy and framework as well. And then where that has led us to today is that China is the largest exporter of EVs, the largest EV market. They have so much capacity in terms of EV development and production that they are aggressively pursuing international markets, in particular emerging markets. So today, if you think about Brazil or Thailand or Mexico, Chinese EVs are upwards of 70% of the market share in those countries, and they continue to expand. So there is a real opportunity in terms of EV transition, not only for autos, by the way, across segments, but we're talking about autos here. And so the question, I think, is what role do we want the industry in the US and by extension North America, because it is all connected, to play in this transition and to take advantage of this opportunity? And so if the answer is a really big role, then what needs to happen, I believe, is first and foremost to have clarity of mission in terms of that role, alignment among the partners, so really to have some constructive engagement about some of the specific hurdles there in terms of supply chain, in terms of adoption, et cetera, and really collaboration through partnerships to be able to get to what we want and understand what type of changes potentially should be made to the framework or what other policy tools can be used as well.
One of the things I'd like to sort of clarify a little bit here in the conversation is that we're sort of talking about some related industries. We've got some AI, some semiconductors. We're talking, I guess, kind of down at the critical minerals where there's kind of refining and mining and refining component. Then it's its use, and we're talking a bit about batteries and EVs, and we're talking about where China is at in each of these sectors. Deanna, and maybe we'll run through each one, but when it comes to where China is at in EVs, you've outlined this, where the US industry is at, what's the gap, right? And how far behind is the US? How fast does the US need to run to really get serious about kind of closing that gap? And how realistic is it?
Yeah, and I think that is the main question. There's going to be a lot of trade-offs from everything we're seeing in terms of the industry. I mean, Chinese products are just extremely competitive, extremely affordable when you think about the prices and comparing that with what we have in North America. And of course, we can talk about why and how companies are able to do that and to achieve those production costs. But I think the gap is pretty big in terms of that technology and affordability. And there's also, some more time. Again, in North America, the U.S. industry specifically has started after dabbling in electric vehicles in the late 90s, really starting to take it a lot more serious in a few recent years, also due to policy framework, enabling environment, et cetera, because it is a huge lever, right? So is the policy framework and the enabling environment really pushing for this? We saw the market respond. We saw companies respond. We saw them commit to electrification targets. And then now there's uncertainty about how important that should be. So, but then what happens with all of those investments I mentioned have already been committed, and those plants and factories, et cetera, are already under construction, right? So do we want to utilize that capital really efficiently? Do we want to enable and push companies to innovate, to look for those white spaces, to really focus on next generation technology, batteries, and what's needed there? So there's a whole ecosystem, right? Infrastructure and workforce, you mentioned workforce too, is the same for EVs. And there are a lot of opportunities to work across the 3 countries. I do believe there is a gap there. Certainly, it's going to take time. It's going to take trade-offs. There is a big production cost that would only also be solved once we reach economies of scale. For that, you need to sell more EVs. For that, you need more affordable EVs, right? So it's a little bit of chicken and egg situation, but I think when there is political will and there's also, partnership with industry, really understanding what it is that they are and in terms of companies and how we can support that transition, I think that can really make a difference.
And just having come back from China and ridden in a number of EVs, the gap is huge. I drive a Tesla on a day-to-day basis, but the Chinese EVs are really amazing in terms of the user interface, and the charging infrastructure, for example, is in China. I think they have 1.8 million chargers. The U.S. has something like 60,000, most of which are Tesla. The other thing is the battery supply chain. I toured facilities in Hefei by 2 of China's leading battery companies, and they're pretty amazing in terms of the scale and the ability to ramp up. And ironically, my son-in-law works for Panasonic at the Tesla Gigafactory in Reno, and so it provides me with a lot of really good intelligence on U.S. battery making. But this is a complicated joint venture with Panasonic, which makes the battery cells, and then ships them over to Tesla for packaging into the battery pack. But again, a very complicated technology. It's people think batteries. It's like, oh, that's easy, right? But it's a really tough technology to scale. To design and scale up at quality, and it's dangerous. There are fires oftentimes in the factory. My son-in-law has to evacuate. So it's that getting to scale is something that China has just done very well. And you're exactly right that there was a decision 10 years ago, 15 years ago to build that entire supply chain and support it with subsidies and other things, and until it became very competitive. And really innovative companies like CATL, particularly, and others, BYD in the battery space, emerged as global leaders. And so that's a challenge, but it's not unsurmountable, but it requires a lot of long-term commitment to all of the things we're talking about: critical minerals, semiconductors, everything.
So Bentley, let me just turn to you then in terms of the piece around mining and refining, because it seems like there's a mining challenge which seems manageable. There seems to be a refining piece which seems even harder, maybe in a similar vein, like sort of level set. And I do want to add this piece. I mean, you mentioned it, Paul, which is that China has been slowly teeing up export restrictions on various rare earths and critical minerals. They haven't pulled the lever yet, but I mean, this kind of gets to how exposed is North America at the moment. And there's clearly a time lag between where we are today and where we need to get to in terms of reducing dependencies. What does that look like? Where are we actually at? How far ahead is China? How realistically, how much faster do we need to run? How much more investment do we really need to make a dent in this?
Yeah, I think that so many interesting questions there. The one thing I would say is that even if we built out mining right now, we'd probably still have to ship all of that mined material to China to be processed. So part of this means bringing new refining capacity on in North America. There's not just a technological challenge there. We actually have some really leading metallurgical expertise in North America, especially in Canada. And that's the one thing also I would say about the administration's interest in jurisdictions like Greenland and Ukraine, which actually maybe they have rocks in the ground, but they don't have mining infrastructure. The most important mining infrastructure is that you have masses of trained engineers who know how to engage in complex metallurgical processes, which Canada, Australia, historic mining nations actually have. So we need to build out that refining capacity in addition to building out the mining capacity, certainly. But it's not even just the processing. There's multiple stages, actually, between the mine and the battery. So we've done some analysis in my lab to look at the U.S. supply chain since the IRA. And while the U.S., as Diana indicated, would have plenty of final cell manufacturing capacity, it currently is slated only to have about 50% of the cathode active material produced in the United States that those battery factories would need, and then something like 10 to 15% of the precursor material that would be needed to then make that cathode active material. And precursor material is already refined to 99.99999%. So it's already been through 1 to 3 stages of refining, depending on which metal we're talking about. So there's a whole other supply chain, and the more upstream you go, the weaker the supply chain in the North American context is. And there's just absolutely no point in mining a bunch of material and then leaving a structural hole right next to it before you get to the battery factory. So you have to build all of these things together. The Canadian government has gotten the strategic picture right. They now, in their update to their critical mineral strategy, have started to actually publish numbers on how bad the structural hole is to get from their own mines to their own battery factories. In part, actually, based on some of the work that I did with a Canadian nonprofit, the Transition Accelerator, which I work with in the Canadian context. But that information is not even really starting to percolate even in the U.S. context yet, let alone in the Mexican context. So governments actually have to build their own capacity to even understand the scale of the challenge that they're facing in building these end-to-end supply chains. And the data situation is really not great for anybody, actually, at the moment.
Let me pause. I mean, there's a lot to go on with, but I do want to open it up to audience Q&A. So if you do have a question, we have roaming mics. Raise your hand. Please introduce yourself and please avoid statements and try to ask questions. Anyone in the audience? This gentleman here at the front.
Thanks. Should I stand or no?
Sorry?
Should I stand or am I good just sitting down?
What?
Should he stand up?
Oh, no, you can if you want. If you just introduce yourself. Just speak a bit louder, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah. So my question is that given that many...
And where are you from, sorry?
So my name's Pablo. My family's Spanish Italian. I live in D.C. I used to go to Columbia. Now I go to American.
Okay.
And I was wondering, my question was that given that many mining companies are operating across American countries like Chile, Peru, Bolivia, many of these companies are Canadian companies, right? How does that affect the Canadian... What's the word here? How does it affect Canadian competitiveness? Because, Canada's having more tariffs and facing a more difficult market. So all these things that they're extracting from all these countries, how competitive is that, not only in Mexico and the U.S., but across the world now that it's more expensive for them to sell their things?
Okay. Did you want to answer that?
Yeah, it would take me the rest of the day to explain ownership patterns in the global mining industry. I'm sure Melissa would also love to have a crack at doing that. I think these things are complicated. There are a lot of Canadian-listed firms, in parts because that's the way we finance mining. We do it through a small number of stock exchanges globally, mainly Toronto and Australian Stock Exchange. There's no reason why there couldn't be a stock exchange in the United States, or like Chicago used to play this role, actually. So there's no reason why the commodity exchanges in the U.S. couldn't become a place where a lot of global companies were listed. But whether it's owned by a Canadian firm or a Mexican firm or an American firm, if the source is Chile or Indonesia, it's going to hit the trade tables from that source country, from Chile or Indonesia. So the ownership structure is almost irrelevant to the tariffs, which is part of the reason why we get ourselves into really absurd knots when we think too hard about where things are made in a global economy with highly globalized value chains and highly globalized distributions of expertise and knowledge about how to do these things. I think the fundamental point is clearly that mining is really hard, both from a financial and a technical perspective, and you need international collaboration in order to do it well. If the current Trump administration really wants to build global critical mineral supply chains, it has to understand that that's a global effort that's going to involve a lot of different countries, a lot of different ownership structures, and it's going to need to have a very clear strategy, and that seems to be absent from the current moment.
Yeah, I guess we've got two gentlemen down the front here.
Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. Could you go into a bit more detail at sort of city by city level within the free countries? Because it would seem, I mean, you mentioned a lot of trade, you know, between states and Canada, that maybe half the states have the leading partner is Canada. It seems to me there's a danger of missing the sort of depth of skill and AI at the level of mayors, cities, at that level of organisation, unless you explain how that fits into the total USMCA model.
Okay. And maybe we'll grab one more question while you're there. Yep.
Thank you very much for all insights that you shared. And yeah, my name is Ömer Akın. I'm from Turkey, from Ministry of Trade of Turkey, and I'm currently LLM student. I'm doing LLM in Business and Finance Law at GW Law School. My question is that, you know, all the issues you discussed somehow related to, you know, having efficient supply chain mechanisms for, you know, having a sustainable foreign trade of U.S. So it's clear that U.S. is going to have, you know, foreign trade deficits for next 2 decades, and you know, current administration is trying to balance these deficits. And one of the important, you know, industry will be automotive industry that U.S. is importing a lot. And when it comes to electric vehicles, we see dominance of, you know, Tesla in local market. So this industry, we all know that, you know, economics of scale is super important. And if newcomers are in the market, they may face, you know, difficulty of having, you know, efficient cost structure. And then, you know, to make sure the market itself is enough competitive, and Tesla has, you know, quite good competitors from domestic market to make this business more sustainable. Do you think government and regulations are doing their job properly? This is the question.
Okay. I'll turn over the panelists to answer either of the questions they see fit. Diana.
Just to clarify, so are the regulations doing the job in terms of enabling economies of scale? Is that what you?
No, just enabling, you know, a fair competition in the market.
I see. Well, I think, yeah, it depends on where, right, where we look at as well. I think, well, Tesla is a specific example, right? And we could talk about that, but I think we want to take a broader view in terms of the entire industry. And as I mentioned, there was some, I think there's been a little bit of back and forth in terms of some of the actions that companies have taken, as well as the policy framework as well, which continues to be just developed. And so I think the bigger point for me is, what is the goal of that? What is it that we want to accomplish? And then do we have the right tools in place to be able to accomplish that? The case of Tesla, they enjoyed government support to be able to get to the point where, you know, they are now as a company, certainly over a lot of years as well. And so there are a lot of factors along with that. And we see in our global work to governments taking different approaches to enabling their own innovation ecosystem, including Turkey, by the way, when it comes to electric vehicles and companies as well, right? So I think we'll keep seeing that. It really depends on the particular context is what I would say.
Yeah, like I believe like that is the question, right? Like how to leverage the ecosystem, like the technological ecosystem regionally, and also like how to remain competitive in this as a one. And that's like the key question for me. And we were talking about like supply chain and how, like, for example, with semiconductors. And we also have to acknowledge like our strengths as a country. For example, for Mexico, we have their resources. We are investing in these innovation hubs, in this semiconductor manufacturing. So how we can put this on the table in the future negotiation. But we must be really clear about that. And we must have a strategy on that. And not only on AI, but in all the like topics we already discussed. And I think, like, for example, in Mexico, that's a challenge to reflect on the fact that what we want to achieve with this and what is our role, and be like really like realistic on that.
Yeah, I guess one question here. Gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Christopher Ojeda. I'm a recent graduate of UC Berkeley. And I apologize, I don't remember who mentioned it, but talking about how Chinese EVs have become very competitive and cost efficient. It's my understanding that part of that is government help that allows them to operate at a loss and focus on innovating. So I was wondering if you could speak more about that and I guess how USMCA could compete with that in upcoming renegotiations.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yes, it's true that, a big factor of why Chinese EV companies are as competitive as they are and able to produce those vehicles as affordable as they are is because of government support that they have enjoyed and subsidies, a lot of subsidies, but that's also based on the regime and just a broader framework as well. I think when you think about China, and so there's a lot of history there, a lot of industrial policy, very top down and very effective in achieving those goals, I think as well. And so comparing that with USMCA, I think it's difficult to compare, like apples. It's not really apples to apples, right? There are a lot of other factors at play as well. And that certainly has contributed again to this gap that we were talking about. So I think the challenge for USMCA partners is, again, what is the role and where do you want to get? And then how can we best leverage the strengths that we have, the complementarities? And I say we as, I'm Mexican living in the US and with family in Canada. So that's why, I just really, this interconnectedness really kind of comes to play also when we think about those connections across the three partners. So it will have to be resolved, I believe, via constructive engagement. And again, really taking into account private sector and industry voices, what is the best way to get there as well.
Well, one of the things I want to do, we've got a few more minutes before we need to wrap, is one of the things I think has become very clear is whether we're talking about AI, semiconductors, critical mineral mining, refining, EV, batteries, is that we need a lot of new investment across all these sectors, and a lot of it's going to be in the United States, but we also need in Mexico and Canada to kind of really build this out. So given that, put yourselves in the shoes of a USMCA negotiator. USMCA is up for review, and give me your top 2-3 things you think you might want to see from an updated agreement that would kind of achieve some of the goals that we've been talking about here today. Let me start with you, Melissa, and we'll run down the panel that way.
I think that we really do need to see more fluidity in the ability for the sort of mining and minerals processing that we were talking about earlier. So, what that description of the minerals from Alaska going to Trail, British Columbia, coming back to the U.S. We need to make room for that kind of innovation and fluidity in the markets and in the movement of materials back and forth. And I do think that that applies really across the board, not just to the minerals space, but to some of the other topics as well. We also, and I'm not sure how you do it through USMCA, but it really is a matter of driving more commitments to long-term investment in these industries. We have to see, why is China so successful? Why do they have such a lead on minerals processing? They plan out 5 years ahead. They commit resources and have strong industrial policy. The US and Canada and Mexico could work together much more efficiently and could regionalize much more. And I think that there's just an opportunity to do that, and we need to take advantage of this relationship to do that kind of regionalization, both in the minerals processing and the recycling side, because failure to do that really results in very bad problems. And one of the things that we do see is that Mexico, in the ICE, in the internal combustion engine vehicle market, becomes a dumping ground for vehicles towards end of life. And so, we don't want to see the same thing happen with EVs. So there's really an opportunity to ensure regionalization in recycling as well as in processing.
Great. Thank you. Bentley.
Thank you. Yeah, I think absolutely investment is essential to the critical minerals. As I said, the principal problem here is that there's so much price uncertainty that it's harming investment, and so you need to provide that price uncertainty if you want to resolve the problem fundamentally. I talk about some pretty wonky details about how you do that with policy instruments in the chapter, but I also think the USMCA would really benefit from a broader perspective on co-investment, which I talk about as well. And I just published with the folks next door at Carnegie a piece called Regaining Geopolitical Advantage, which outlines how a variety of countries could work together in order to drive investment in critical minerals and other clean energy supply chains globally. And I do think that international collaborative approach is absolutely essential if we want to reduce risk on China while building the innovative industries that'll help our economies for decades.
Great. Fiona.
Yeah, and I think I just, remarking also on the fact that all of these things we're talking about really relate to also, pushing forward with the energy transition and understanding the opportunity and the challenges that brings. And the fact that we can have conversations, again, that involve the three partners is just really, really important as we look at ahead at the review process, or depending on what shape that might take as well. I think it is mostly thinking about retaking stock of where we are, right? It's a very different time now than 2020, as you mentioned it also, Josh, in your intro, and things have changed a lot. So where are we now, and what do we need to do to really enable further growth? And one of the key parts for me in terms of investment is, again, looking at those next generation technologies. So really assessing what it is, the strengths that we have, and also what it is that we need to do to be able to get to the next level and ensure that opportunity, really the partners are tapping into those opportunities and are collectively agreeing on the way forward.
Great. Paul.
I have three suggestions. One is a dedicated semiconductor chapter, similar to the digital trade chapter that focuses on risk semiconductor supply chain issues. Second, a regional semiconductor fund to establish a trilateral investment mechanism for fabrication facilities and R&D and some of the other, and maybe workforce development. And then the third one is a talent mobility program. So make sure that there are visa pathways for semiconductor specialists to move between all three countries. And then I would say also on EVs, how about settling on the Tesla standard for charging for North America? As a Tesla driver, I was very happy to see a Chevy Bolt plugged into a supercharger that I use frequently using an adapter, because Tesla has opened up its charging infrastructure in North America, and I think that's going to be a standard in North America, but that could be extended across the border.
No, great. Yeah, love it. Daniela.
Push this agenda in the conversation, especially around frontier technologies such as AI, and 4 key areas. The first one, strategic investment, as our panelists already mentioned that, because we are thinking about we already talked the supply chain, and Marco Rubio already pointed out that we need to secure our supply chain on the Western Hemisphere. For that, we need investment. That's it. And then we need to align industrial policies. 3, we're developing a unified regional strategy, taking into consideration the 3 countries, and finally promote specialized training programs. So that's it.
Thank you so much. I mean, one of the things that's always been well understood, I think, about trade agreements is the key benefit is policy certainty, right, which you need for investment, which we don't obviously have currently. So the message is let's resolve these issues and let's create a more policy-certain environment because we need this investment if we're going to make progress. Thank you so much to the panel. That was a very rich and full discussion. Thank you to the audience. We're going to take a 5-minute break, so we can reconvene. It's sort of almost 3:05. We reconvene back here at 3:10 for the next panel. The entire US government.
Yeah, and there's a school of...
Oh, you got it?
I've got some thanks.
Yeah, I know we got to talk about it. No, just so you know, I'm just going to talk about it.
Great. So it's my pleasure to start the second panel for today, and we have two fantastic panelists. To my immediate right is John Stackhouse, who's a nationally best-selling author, one of Canada's leading voices on innovation and economic disruption, and he's currently Senior Vice President in the Office of the CEO at the Royal Bank of Canada, where he leads the organisation's research and thought leadership on economic, technological and social change. And very pleased to have Leila Mafas, who's Director of Global Public Policy at Toyota. She's got over 20 years of experience in international trade investment, business strategy, economic development and geopolitical risk analysis. She's currently the Director of Global Public Policy at Toyota, where she has created and led the North American Office for Trade and Investment Security. And previously, she was a Director for Export Promotion at the United States Trade and Development Agency It's also held positions at Grant Thornton and the World Economic Forum. So pleasure to have two extremely qualified panels for this discussion today. So as I foreshadowed in my initial remarks, I do want to do a little bit of two things on this panel. One is to have a little bit of a bigger picture discussion around what's going on in North America. Having said that, I think because we are in a breaking news environment, I feel like we cannot ignore the fact that there has been a development on the auto front. And Leila, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you to give me Toyota's views on this at all. But I do feel that we may want to pull in some of that as a way of maybe taking the big picture down to the particular. As James Joyce once said about the universe being contained in the particular, we can do a bit of both, I think. So let me start with. John, let me start with you, and just give me a sense. I actually want to take a step back from the data and the tariffs and the numbers, and just talk about. Give me a sense of like what the sense in Canada at the moment, right? Like how are Canadians feeling at kind of almost at a personal level, but you can at a national level about what's going on in the United States at the moment.
How many Canadians are in the audience here? Well, yes. Okay. Shall we like collectively start booing just because that's our new kind of national? Canadians are hurt, wounded, and angry, and also disappointed, I would say. And you're seeing this expressed at sports events with booing. You're seeing it with boycotts. You're seeing it with the removal of American products from shelves and people generally celebrating that. All curious to see how much of this is an emotional response, which isn't too surprising, and will Canadians endure the economic consequences of that? We'll see. But there is a very strong sentiment right now. There's rarely a universal sentiment in any country, but there's a very strong sentiment in Canada that we need to protect and invest in Canadian interests first and foremost. And that's actually, week by week, going to make it more difficult to find off-ramps and develop constructive options here. Options that were on the table 4 or 5 weeks ago for new forms of cooperation, cross-border, energy resource sharing. Previous panel talked about critical minerals, some very creative ideas about joint approaches to managing critical minerals in a Canada-US framework. New approaches to Arctic security, military bases, for instance, maybe dual-use infrastructure in the Arctic. All still possible, and maybe we'll get there. It's hard to imagine any political leader right now in Canada standing up and saying, "I'm going to, go to Washington with this, with this idea." So it, may just take some time for emotions to come down, for a bit of rational action and reaction to settle in, and maybe that's what we're seeing in what appear to be the step back from tariffs on the auto sector today. We'll see, and dialogues like this. So thank you, Brookings, for doing this, and also Josh for your excellent work. Actually, are really important because just keeping people talking, sharing ideas, developing ideas is critical, as you all know, so that when that moment comes, when maybe a bit of logic prevails, when emotions calm, and nations look at their long-term strategic interests together, some of the ideas of coming out of forums like this will be there.
Great. Leila, you've been working at Toyota for a long time. Toyota is a major trinational company, invested heavily across the 3 countries. Just level set for us, run us through your footprint here, how you think about your investment strategy across North America, what that looks like today, and what you hope it might look like going forward.
Yes, well, thank you, Joshua. And yes, Toyota is a truly global automaker. In fact, for second year in a row, we are the world's largest automaker, and we sell our products in nearly 200 markets all across the world and manufacture them and about 28 markets. And here in North America, this is really our largest presence that we have. And we are proud to have 11 plants all across the United States, and 2 plants in Canada and 2 plants in Mexico. And quite frankly, I would say that our company was born and raised under the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which became law in 1994. And at that time, we built our first plant in the region, which was in Georgetown, Kentucky. And remarkably, that is our largest plant in the entire world. That usually surprises a lot of people. And our most recent plant is a new battery plant that we're building in Liberty, North Carolina. And this is a $14 billion investment that will employ 5,000 people. And it is truly the largest single investment in a single place in Toyota's 88-year history. So nowhere else in the world have we done that. And we decided to do that here in North Carolina, and really on the heels of the USMCA. And because it provided us with that certainty and that ability to build that and to have the flexibility to create batteries, not just for full battery electric vehicles, but also plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and hybrid electric vehicles. And I think, the one thing that I learned a lot joining Toyota in 2016, so right in time for the negotiations of the USMCA, is that here in North America, it's not so much that we trade parts across borders with each other. I mean, really, our economies are so tightly knit that we build things together. And that makes us stronger. And that is why North America is the second largest auto producing region in the world. And that really is based upon the U.S., which is the second largest auto producing country in the world, which is remarkable when you consider that the U.S. is also the leader in technology and innovation and R&D. It has the most sophisticated capital markets. It has all these other things, but to still maintain its leadership in auto manufacturing. And that's thanks to the integration with our neighbors. And a true, I think, USMCA success story is that for Toyota, we have an engine plant in West Virginia where we bring in parts and components from suppliers based in Mexico to build those engines in West Virginia. And they go to Canada, where they're built into products such as the RAV4, which is then imported into the U.S. And remarkably, of those Canadian-built vehicles that are imported into the U.S., the vast majority of the parts components inside are American, are U.S. made. And that is wonderful. That is great. And that enables us to make the United States an export hub for Toyota. Now, I mentioned that we manufacture our parts and components in 28 markets. But would you believe that from the U.S., we export our U.S.-made goods to 60 other markets around the world? That means that we're able to produce those products, not just vehicles, but engines and transmissions, at a price that is competitive in these third country markets. And again, that is attributable to the USMCA and to our ability to work across all 3 borders to work together. And I also just wanted to take a moment to thank you, Josh and Mary Carmen, and everyone at Brookings, Ibrahim, to do this event. I've been coming to them since you launched it. So I guess you would say I'm a long-time spectator, first-time speaker. So thank you for inviting me to speak on the panel. And regarding the breaking news, just moments ago, the White House press secretary announced that there would be a pause in the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico for vehicles that comply with the USMCA. Now, as my colleague from Magna here and I will, my colleagues from Toyota will say, we need to read the details to see what that entails, what's covered. Does it include parts and components or just vehicles, and is applied to all companies? And of course, what are the other provisions and what comes after that pause, that 30-day pause? So we're very hopeful for what this might mean, but we do need to see the details. And I'm proud to say that Toyota is, of course, one of the companies that fully complies with the USMCA. We were proud to be part of the talks to discuss an agreement for North America, and we were champions for it and sought its approval. But we're hopeful that it'll be good news for us as we dive into those details.
Great. Thanks, Lena. That's very helpful. just sort of, again, I think building the context here, we've got tariffs, presumably, so we may be in a world where we have some tariffs coming into effect, or are in effect, but are going to be implemented. We have some which may be paused, so it's a kind of an unclear picture. Canada, John, has said that it's going to retaliate. We've had governors weighing in with various options. What should Canada do in this sort of complex environment, do you think?
It's really hard when you're dealing with such imperfect information, and I think that's part of the government's frustration as well. This is not a negotiation where you have, you know who you're dealing with, there's an exchange of information, there's kind of an operating model for it. This is much more ad hoc. So don't envy anyone in that situation. So remaining calm, number one. Sticking to core principles. I think this is one of the challenges for Canada and presumably for Mexico right now is we have a legally binding agreement in the USMCA, and we are a country, as is the United States, that lives by the rule of law. We assume our property is safe. We have all sorts of things that we take for granted in our lives. No one gets to take your car, right? That's called theft. We have laws that protect that. And USMCA is part of that legal structure that allows all of you as business people, as investors, as citizens, to not even have to think about whether your factory is safe, your inventory is going to flow without undue interruption. So it's important that we all remind ourselves that there's a legal process. Be that as it may, I think we also have to recognize that the opening up of the USMCA has already begun. So let's get on with that. And that will be, I suspect, important. We're going to have a new prime minister come the start of next week. And then we'll probably go into a national election from there and have a clear mandate for a government in May or June. Coming out of that, so it's not too far off, I think it would be important for the governments, or at least for Canada and Mexico, to say, let's start a process here. We cannot have this sort of negotiation through digital channels. Let's sit down and have a clear negotiation, understand what each of our objectives are in that, and that's a tough process. But get on with that.
So I mean, I guess this leads into the question of what do we think ultimately President Trump wants here, and there are two sort of views here, and they're sort of somewhat in tension, right? One is that this is part of essentially setting the table for a renegotiation. The other one, which is that this will be more permanent, and the tariff somehow will be a revenue offset to future tax cuts. How do you think through that?
Well, I'll maybe jump into that one first. If you haven't read Bob Lighthizer book, please do. It's pretty clear there what the objectives are. And balanced trade is just said over and over and over again. So understanding what balanced trade is, whether you agree with that or not, is one of the objectives of the administration. For Canada, you heard Victor state earlier that in goods trade, we actually have a deficit, so maybe we should be a little more agitated than we are when you remove energy. So our question to the United States is, do you want balanced trade? Maybe we should sell our energy elsewhere. In fact, we just built something called the TMX pipeline to the coast to help diversify oil exports for this reason, among others. So get it to Vancouver, get it on ships, go to Asia. What's happened in the first year of that operation? And it's about 500,000 barrels a day. Leave Vancouver, they go out into the Pacific, they turn left, they go down the coast, and they stop at Los Angeles. They unload at Los Angeles, and the oil comes into America. Should we try to stop that if America's buying that on the open seas? Because that becomes part of this perceived surplus. So that's part of the conversation. Do you want less Canadian oil? Do you want less Canadian potash? We provide 60%, I think, of American potash. Okay, that's another way to balance trade. you want less uranium? There's lots of other countries that would like Canada's uranium. We happen to be blessed with a good chunk of the world's best uranium. I think no is the answer to all of those because trade balances out in more complex ways. But understanding, and I'm not trying to belittle the objective of the administration, understanding maybe the concern under that, which has been the gutting of American manufacturing, particularly in the heartland, over the last many decades. Okay, if that's the objective function, and we have the same challenge in Canada, we've lost thousands of factories in central Canada. How do we work together to call it reshore or whatever else it is? And maybe the issue there is with China or other competitors that are not playing by the same rules as we are. But that gets into an economic strategy conversation. But does USMCA 2.0 become more of a collective industrial strategy to more aggressively reshore? Maybe. Yep. But that's what we need to talk through.
Yeah. I do want to pick up on this balanced trade piece just very briefly. I don't want to get into the ins and outs of trade deficits, but there seems to be a couple of ways you can cut the balanced trade argument. One is obviously the bilateral kind of deficit surpluses, and there's views that these are the ones we should not be focusing on, but the broader surplus deficit dynamics in the global economy where you have the US as a long-term deficit country. In that respect, Mexico is largely a deficit country. Canada generally runs deficits or somewhat balanced trade. Australia is a deficit country, but then you have China as a very large surplus country, Germany, and the kind of internal dynamics in those countries which generate the surpluses, which essentially export those policies into countries like the United States, seem to be a genuine area of focus and concern. And I think this is kind of one way of thinking about deficits and surpluses. I'd love to get your responses to that. And now I think there's a question of do we agree that this is a healthy or constructive approach to thinking about how do we make the trading system more balanced?
I think we have to, it's hard to speculate about policy goals or objectives, but I think big picture, what we want here across all three economies is just robust employment, right? We want cutting edge innovation, right? We want to make sure that where our economies are thriving, that all segments of society are benefiting from that thriving, that we don't have this hollowing out. I think that's absolutely critical. And how do we do that, right? And I think what while we're trying to achieve these goals, it's simultaneously happening with in a new 21st century where everything is changing so rapidly. I mean, we're still in the turbulent 20s, age of this century. And so what we're seeing is that things that normally would take maybe years or decades to manifest are just hyper accelerated. And so maybe the structures, the frameworks, the way that we do things is in industry and policy or whatever are not really appropriate for what we're seeing now. And I think that's what we need to do together. And quite frankly, the problems that we face, whether we're talking about geopolitical risks, whether we're talking about health, the global pandemic is still in our rearview mirror, whether we're talking about innovation and the threats and also the opportunities that poses. These are too big for anybody to handle on their own, right? And so how do we do it in a way where we truly can tap the best of, industry, private sector, public sector, NGOs, civil society, labor, to all work together to come up with solutions, but recognizing that we have to be a little bit quicker in how we do this. We can't, postulate and have a forum and, we're going to meet once a year in this city and then we're going to come up with everything and then all go home and forget what we discussed. I mean, how do we do it in a way that's actionable, that really takes into account what the dynamics are, but also we have to be crystal clear on what our goals are. And that gets to your point. Is that maybe the best metric now?
Yeah.
Right? Do we need another metric? Just recognizing, especially how capital flows are, especially as we move to more like digital currency and other ways of moving. Is there maybe we need to have a new measure of what it means to be successful? And maybe that measure needs to be, maybe we need to zoom out a little bit and maybe to think who else should be included in that metric and how we include them. And I think these are questions that we need to answer. We need to answer them really quickly. We don't have the luxury of convening once a year in a ski resort to do it. Like, we have to really get together and move it quickly. Because if anything we've seen in the past 43 days is that things can move quickly when there's a will and there's a way. And so what are the lessons learned from that?
Yeah.
And how can we harness that?
Yep. John, any reflections on that?
No, that's very, very well said.
Okay. Let me bring China back into the conversation then, right? Because I think one of the deafening silences around this conversation around North America and USMCA has been the absence of China in the space at the moment. I think there was a working hypothesis that China should be the focus of concern geopolitically from a security perspective and otherwise when it comes to US policy, and that the US, Canada, Mexico partnered together are stronger, more effective, more capable in dealing with the challenges that China presents. And the panel before that obviously got into some of these areas in critical minerals and EVs and batteries, AI and so forth. But that is not how things seem to be playing out, at least at the moment. What's going on? Why not at this point? I mean, do you have a theory of the case there? And I'd like to just bring in this more specific trade issue of circumvention. And John, get your perspective on, how you're seeing that from a Canadian perspective. What's Canada doing about that as well?
Well, it is an issue, and the U.S. is right to be concerned about it. The data shows that it is most significantly via Mexico. But we've seen challenges both in manufacturing as well as investment and other flows in Canada. Now, we've had a slightly different experience over the last 5 years through the Meng dispute that really chilled things between Canada and China. So we started to reject Chinese investment in a number of properties, particularly ones that were seen as strategically important, mining as an example in Canada, not because of pressure from the United States, but just a feeling that our relationship was chilled. We moved very quickly with the U.S. on EV tariffs as another example. So I think there is a genuine interest in Canada to continue to explore ways to work with our allies, and the United States being our most critical ally, to ensure that we have a level playing field with Chinese manufacturers as well as on the investment front. This is becoming crystal clear on critical minerals, as you heard from the previous panel, where Canada has a significant store of critical minerals. You heard about germanium and gallium, tungsten, and many others, and a genuine concern in Canada about if we invest in the development of these, we need security of demand, particularly from the U.S. So this can come through things like DoD procurement, long-term procurement agreements. But we probably will need some sort of state intervention or participation, not intervention, to ensure floor pricing. Because any person in the critical minerals business will tell you, well, even if everything is giddy up, funny enough, as soon as the project is ready to go, the global market just gets flooded with what we're about to produce. Funny that, and prices tank. So I think everyone has seen enough of this to know that it's going to take state engagement to level set with what is ultimately state engagement from one of our key competitors in the critical minerals space. That is going to take more Canadian-U.S. cooperation, as I said, for procurement, but also for processing, because a lot of this will be cross-border. It's a great example of what Teck does in Trail BC, and we'll I suspect see a lot more of that. And that's one of the opportunities for Canada and the U.S. once we work through the tariff challenge, once we advance USMCA, and hopefully we can into its next chapter, to start to explore those strategic opportunities to work together in this kind of new trading environment.
Great. Lady, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Josh, to your point, I think what was maybe on the periphery when USMCA was first negotiated was now going to be in the spotlight. And I think that's an opportunity. And I think that really does, and especially, you know, taking John's example with the critical minerals, I mean, in ways that we can work together. The challenge is going to be the demand. And quite frankly, to have the demand, we're going to have to all work together, governments, industry, everyone, to really produce that demand. But we're also going to have to align on other things just to create secure critical mineral supply chain. Secure from an investment perspective, meaning aligning on like FDI screening rules and what we allow for equity ownership of whether it's the mines or the processing or refining facilities, but also aligning on things like measures like anti-dumping, countervailing duties, right? Because if one market has them in place, another doesn't, then the risk is that they could seep through the cracks that way. And the other is to get to we've seen that play out many times, that movie many times, when, you know, whether it's going back to the, you know, oil prices start to go down or start to go up and they flood the market, just when people start to really invest in alternative sources, is to look at what are the price stability mechanisms, right? Can we you know, sort of specify what are strategic minerals that we need, and for each one, like, what is our price band for it? And if somebody starts to dump on the market below that floor that we've set, how are we collectively going to address that? Collectively impose tariffs, collectively do other things to make sure that we can, again, secure and protect the investments that are made in our region. And then the goal being that one day we're the big, not just for our own consumption across NA, but really supplier to the world market for these minerals.
Let me turn to a related issue, which is around R&D and innovation. Auto sector, one of the most innovative and R&D intensive sectors, and would love to get into a little bit around how Toyota thinks about innovation in North America. How do you do that, and how does that get supported? And John, how do Canada and the United States typically, more big picture, innovate and work together, whether it's people, R&D labs, and so forth?
Yeah, to start, I have to say here in North America, 75% of our spend when you build vehicles are suppliers. Our supplier partners are the cutting edge of innovation. And they are, I mean, we do a lot in-house, but let's be crystal clear that it is our supply base that really comes forward with a lot of the wonderful innovations that you see in the vehicle. And that's why we rely upon them so heavily, and why we really work together so closely. But for Toyota, actually, the Toyota Research Institute is headquartered here, which always surprises people a lot, where we do a lot of our cutting edge research and development globally. Also, our venture capital arm, Toyota Ventures, which is based in the Valley and also has campuses in Michigan, it also does a lot of investing in startups. Who not even actually directly related to autos or mobility, a lot of clean tech and other things as well, but really because we want to foster that ecosystem and then our ability to work together. But really, that's such a fundamental part of it, and that's why it's so incredibly important that our suppliers remain financially strong. And sadly, many of them are still clawing their way out of the COVID pandemic. And when that struck, they were clawing their way out of the global financial crisis. And so a lot of them are still financially fragile. And it's very important, especially those companies that are lower down the supply chain tiers, have the sort of stability and the certainty that they need to make the decision, so that we have the privilege of providing products to a wide base of customers. But really, the root of that is our suppliers up through the entire chain. And that's why things like tariffs and other things really cause such harm, in which we want to avoid those scenarios.
It's such a great question, because we too often just look at trade in isolation, and trade is the incentive for so much innovation. We have a bit of it's an understatement, a historic technology race on right now principally between the United States and China. Others are in it. And China is doing exceedingly well on a number of advanced technologies, ones that we know and ones that we're probably not so familiar with, both here on Earth and in space. One of the United States' great allies in this is Canada, and has been for a long time. If you saw the movie Oppenheimer, it's full of Canadians who you don't know by name. The Manhattan Project was deeply connected to Canada, to places like Chalk River, to McGill University, University of Toronto, where so many of the physicists and math brainiacs came from. And that was a joint research project, even though America owned it and ran point on it. And we've got a wonderful history over a lifetime of examples like that, and we're seeing that today in AI. And we can continue to do that. Our universities, University of Waterloo, has just amazing networks with the Valley, U of T and McGill the same. And we don't need, complex agreements for this, because we have literally fluency, not just in language, but in culture and standards. It is just a fantastic relationship. And trade is one of the incentives for that. So you see the innovation in the auto sector and what's going on with autonomous vehicles. Wabi, this great AV company out of the University of Toronto, has now got trucks, I think now or like in a matter of weeks, autonomous driving trucks on the highway in Texas. So that's just part of that wonderful two-way flow. And the owner of it, Raquel Urtasun, great Torontonian, wants this to be on the interstate within a couple of years. And this is something that the U.S. and Canada can beat China at, and we can do that together. And we don't need, as I mentioned, complex agreements with that. But trade is a really important incentive for that, because not just for those trucks, which will be partly made in Canada, partly made in the U.S., but for all that you're doing and others are doing in passenger vehicles, in sense that R&D, it's the capitalist system. Right, and that is proven over and over again to be the winning system. So I hope in all this challenge that it's short term, but that we don't lose sight of that strategic opportunity here to develop the technologies, to innovate, and do that together. Certainly for Canada and the U.S. as two sort of strong brain power economies in ways that respect our rules-based capitalist system while we're being challenged by other systems elsewhere in the world.
Great. I was trying to step back and ask a question about global strategy for Canada, right? So, I mean, Canada is very dependent on the US export market. That is not going to change in any meaningful time period, and hopefully it shouldn't have to. But Canada has also been, I think, quite successful signing trade agreements with the EU. Globally, there's conversations going on with other countries. How does that play out for Canada? What kind of impetus has these current tariff threats given to that? What can Canada do kind of in the short term versus sort of what it looks like in the medium term in terms of sort of diversification? Is it thinking in those terms and so forth?
Yeah, I'd say that's priority number one for whoever forms government, and both leading parties are very focused on this. So it will take, number one, significant investments in infrastructure, strategic infrastructure, pipelines, for instance, to multiple coasts, ports and rail systems to multiple coasts to get our resources to tidewater, then much more assertive ambitious is probably a better word, global marketing to ensure those tankers don't turn left and take a hard left there, but actually do set sail across the two big oceans. Trade agreements are a piece of paper. We need to be much better at activating those trade agreements, and that includes the private sector, which has, lots has been studied on this, which has been too comfortable just serving the U.S. market. And if nothing else, I spoke at the beginning about how irritated Canadians are. I think there's also a recognition that this is the moment, this is the kick in the pants that we need to focus on other markets. We're at roughly 70% exports, depending on how you count it, to the U.S. It used to be 80. It used to be, I can remember when it was 90. It'll get to 60, but these take decades. But this has been a signal to a whole swath of companies and entrepreneurs across the country to get on an airplane or get on a Zoom call somewhere and sell your stuff elsewhere. So major infrastructure investments, which I would anticipate coming. New approaches to permitting, as well as in the Canadian context to Indigenous consent, which is a critical conversation for us, but that's moving faster in our country, and Indigenous communities want to be part of this. They want to help facilitate this and have a say and share in it, and then working with others. And that doesn't mean abandoning the United States, but diversifying, I think, is something no one would fault Canada for wanting to do.
Yeah. I want to take a pause here. I've got a lot of questions I could ask and open up, see if there's any audience questions. If you've got a question, raise your hand. Please just say where you're from, and please ask a question rather than making a statement. I've got two questions here, one here and one back there. Yep.
Hi, my name is Timothy Kasuma. I work at Third Way. Rules of origin are quite high for car manufacturers if they want to follow the USMCA system. And so I'm curious if the placement of these tariffs on both Canada and Mexico have outsized impacts on companies that are trying to follow through with the rules of origin.
So if the tariffs do not have an exemption for USMCA qualifying products, that's where the challenge is, right? Because the USMCA, not only was it, created, negotiated, approved, and enacted all during President Trump's first term, which, I mean, even for a normal FTA would be quite a feat, but for an FTA that is so comprehensive and especially for the auto industry and such significant changes, I mean, that's really like a tremendous achievement, honestly. And so I think a lot of companies, including Toyota, made a lot of moves to meet those higher standards. And so that's why hoping that there's a recognition that that was a significant investment in order to comply with the agreement, and so that there would be an exemption or from any of these tariffs. Because otherwise, to face the tariffs when you've already done so much to really localize your production and all these other things, environmental standards, the sourcing standards, that would be just a really challenging situation. And you actually, based on your question, I want to follow up with something that John said, where he said that a trade agreement is really just a piece of paper. That's kind of true with treaties, kind of true with a lot of things. And so think about that. What brings them to life is the decisions companies make. It's just an FTA. What brings it to life is where companies decide to invest, to build, to hire, to make, to do their R&D, and to sell. So we're bringing it to life, and we're making what are multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade investment decisions based upon the terms of that agreement. And I think the USMCA is novel in that it has this modernizing mechanism, as we heard on the first panel. That's great, and I think it's an opportunity, for Toyota. The spirit of Kaizen, continuous improvement. There's always opportunities to improve, and maybe some of these measures for critical minerals or other things that we discussed, but that is foundational. Being able to make these decisions is the ability to trust that the rules that are in place when you make these decisions remain in place, at least for like the life cycle of those decisions.
Here's a quick additional point, because I don't want to lose it with the time left.
Yep.
One of the huge risks right now is the chill that this is putting on investment in all our countries, understandably. And we need to sort of reflect on that at this critical moment in the world, when lots is going on elsewhere, China's not going to slow up on what it's doing. Others are not going to slow up, waiting for us to have a bit of a timeout and get our system together. Can we afford to lose a year or 2 years with this internal battle back and forth as we try to figure out the next arrangement? You talked about things moving quickly. Think of what our competitors can do in 2 years if we let them. There is a huge amount of capital on this continent waiting and wanting to go to invest in all these opportunities, from critical minerals to advanced manufacturing. And with the right trade agreements in place, man, we can really accelerate. But equally, we can lose some critical steps to those big competitors in other geographies.
Yeah, that's a point well taken. We had gentlemen, a few questions. We'll grab a few questions. Yeah, you, and then we've got in front this younger gentleman first, and then this other gentleman, and then there's someone here. We'll grab 3 questions for the panel.
Good afternoon, panel. My name is Amen. I'm a journalism student at Howard, and I'm kind of new to the whole concept of trading, and I'm really trying to understand, like, can you give more detail on, like, tariffs and how they play a part in kind of the interconnectedness of trading and mining in different countries? So thank you.
Okay, great.
William Michael Cunningham, Creative Investment Research, also a graduate of Howard University, so I salute this young man. My question concerns the impact, what you're seeing from, I guess I should stand up, what you're seeing from the sovereign wealth funds and from the large pension plans like CalPERS and others in terms of corporate governance policies, or what you think their corporate governance policies are going to be relating to this whole tariff uncertainty. You know, I mean, have they issued any statements? I haven't seen anything. I think everybody is confused. So I'd be curious as to your opinion. And then the other concern we have is the impact of the extractive industries on communities of color. And we know Mexico, U.S., Canada have historically taken advantage of communities of color with respect to extractive resources. So I'm wondering if there was anything in USMCA that addressed that. Thank you.
And one further question, Dozy. Yep, great.
Hello, my name's MacDonald from London as a policy advisor. I wonder if there are any lessons for the USMCA from the EU and Britain's Brexit vote in 2016 in terms of both the public and legislatures understanding basic data and statistical information and economic concepts, whether it's terms of trade or comparative advantage. The problem is not in this room or on C-SPAN 3 audiences. It's out there, and we've had a problem in Britain. I suspect there's a problem in North America too. Thank you.
Great. Over to you to work out which questions.
You should answer a couple of those, Josh. You seem perfectly.
Yeah, no, but I can jump in, but yeah, please.
Let me take a run at the sovereign wealth fund question, because we're in this fascinating period of economic transition where we will have industrial strategies by whatever name they are called, and that will include increasing pressure in various countries for large pools of capital, whether they're sovereign wealth funds or otherwise, to invest in strategic priorities for that country or for alliances, fraught with all sorts of risks that you all understand. But it's fascinating, even just yesterday, to see the the BlackRock investment in Panama. Well, that's a signal of probably more like that to come. So if we accept that as part of the political economy of the late 2020s, how do we ensure that trade agreements and investment agreements ensure that it's done transparently, that there are fair standards, which maybe speaks to the point about human rights, which should be an ongoing part of USMCA, without expecting trade agreements to become policy tools for all sorts of concerns in society, which is where trade agreements, and the EU is part of that, tend to create great frustration in publics, because they're used to try to correct all sorts of, especially non-commercial concerns in society.
Layla, did you want to jump in on any of that?
Yeah, I think absolutely right. And I think there are other things, like maybe look at education policy or workforce training policy or energy policy or other things that government should use rather than these trade agreements. And for trade, what it does is that countries have tariffs on products that come into their country. And so there's the World Trade Organization, which kind of set up what's called this most favored nation framework for all 164 members. And everybody's MFN rate was varied, but basically if you grant it to one, you got to grant it to all. And so what happened is there's a lot of concern that with the WTO is this consensus-based model, meaning everybody's got to agree to a rule change, which it's hard enough to get my family four to agree where to go to dinner at night. So I don't know how they get 164 people to agree to these rules. So that's why people started doing trade agreements, right? You know what? Let's just do something here in North America, and let's do something there, and let's do something there. And so what that is to lower tariffs, to make it easier to work together, to build together, to invest together, to these other things. And so with these tariffs, what that is adding basically like harder to do that, you know, and maybe it's to correct something where there's like an unfair practice that needs to be addressed, or maybe there's something else, or, you know, we've heard a lot about reciprocity. Like if I say it's this X amount, and you have another amount, you need to have it X amount. That's one of the great things about USMCA. Of course, it was reciprocal across all three countries. And so that's where sort of that was like trade 101 in a couple minutes, but.
And I'll just say briefly to just responding to a couple of the questions. On the question about the impact on coloured people, I mean, I think that there are relevant provisions, and it's not these trade agreements are not complete answers. There are binding labour standards, which is new in USMCA, and there is environmental standards. So the sort of second and third order impacts of a lot of activity on poorer communities, which tend to be people colours, is sort of indirectly certainly addressed through that. Look, it's an interesting question about Brexit. I mean, I think there's a lot of differences clearly between the relationship in North America than what is happening in the EU. So I wouldn't want to overdo that analogy. I think, you know, we do have enough data now to know that the UK is clearly worse off outside of Europe than in Europe. I don't think the data is ambiguous on that at all. And it really kind of, I think, speaks to, you know, the broader proposition, which is that you know, tariffs at the end of the day are taxes, right? And taxes are creating inefficiencies, and we end up with, you know, less productive industry, which employs less people and pays lower wages. We've done work on this. Peterson Institute across Silver Road has done work on this. JP Morgan's put out a paper on this. I mean, everyone's reaching the same conclusions. It's not rocket science. And so, you know, it speaks to the basic kind of premise, which kind of brings us to trade in the first place, that we are better off by exchanging goods, capital, and ideas across borders than trying to do it all at once. It's also just fundamentally true that the United States can't make everything here. Right? It's already a fairly fully employed economy. You know, there's a bigger conversation about what's been happening to manufacturing and manufacturing employment broadly. If you look at trends globally, going back to the 1950s, whether in Germany or South Korea or Australia or Canada or the United States, employment manufacturing has been declining well before the WTO, well before China became a trading powerhouse, and so forth. And these secular trends are very much driven by technology. Trade has played a role for sure, but, you know, it's a small part of the story. And how do we think about manufacturing and manufacturing employment in sort of modern industrial economies, I think, is really a key question, which trade policy can only address at the margins at the end of the day. So it's a complex question, but I think the takeaway is the US will be worse off if the USMCA was to fall apart, as would Canada and Mexico. Any final comments from either of you before we wrap?
Let's keep working together. trade, and I think maybe one of the lessons from the EU, as with any trade agreement, is there's always friction. There's always grievances. There's always frustrations. Economies evolve and tend to evolve faster than the trade agreements that underpin them. So ensuring that there are opportunities, and here's where we've lost a beat, because there are structured opportunities to revisit it. And we've lost a bit of that beat, but let's try to get back into that cadence of working together and having a more structured approach to revising, sharing knowledge. But you think of what North America can do together. I loved you kicked it off with that point about, was it 40% growth in exports since just 2018? I mean, that's 2020. I mean, that's a really powerful number. Let's remind ourselves of what we would be giving up. Like, that would be lost if we didn't find ways to work together. I think, and another point, a little unrelated to that, is again a lesson from Europe. Is it's really challenging to balance trade policy and monetary policy. And that's just part of the tensions, and that's also what's going on with the United States as the world's reserve currency, the dollar being much stronger than it might be on its own trade merits, and therefore Americans are rightly frustrated that they're losing a bit of maybe competitive advantage, but that's a bit of the price as well of being a reserve currency. So maybe there's some ideas that groups like this can also evolve on how do you smooth that out a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. Is how can we identify what are those points of friction, like, and be specific. Properly identify what the root cause of it is so that we use the right remedy, right, to fix it. And then simultaneously, I'm really excited about optimizing the opportunities, because I think, the USMCA, like, we're just getting started. Like, we're really just getting started. I think we're really at an inflection point, and we have the ability, 40% growth during COVID. Like, let's not forget, this agreement became the law of the land right before we had a global pandemic, and those are the numbers we had. Just imagine where we can go, moving forward. And so I look forward to exploring that further and taking USMCA forward, to use your title.
Great.
And thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you. That was a very rich and informative discussion. Thank you to everyone for staying around for the afternoon, for your questions. And that's a wrap. Thanks a lot.